This will be the backdrop for the Dragon Secret Compartment box. I'm starting out by blocking in the lights and darks using an airbrush. The paint used here is thinned down acrylic paint. With the pressure lower and the airbrush much closer to the surface, I'm adding in the tree trunks. An advantage of using an airbrush for this project is that the wood surface is fairly uneven, and I'm able to get a smooth application of paint that looks like a misty forest without the addition of brush strokes. I had a basic reference in mind for this, but instead of sketching it, I just loosely applied paint with the airbrush and then further developed details depending on how everything looked and let the misty look kind of take over. Once I had some basic shapes in, I switched over to a brush and started adding in some color. The idea is to have the sun somewhat overhead, but so much mist in the forest that it's blocking a lot of the light, so only some of the color will seep through. I'm focusing the warmer tones on the light areas and cooler tones in the shadows. With everything basically developed here, I've sealed in this base coat using a spray lacquer so that I can further develop the design on top without damaging the underpainting. I switched back to the airbrush to start blocking in some of the branches, giving that a bit more detail and creating my brightest brights and my darkest darks. Much of this painting will be covered by the dragon head itself, so the center is fairly empty as opposed to having any sort of focal point, since the dragon will be the focal point. But I find it easier to develop the painting as a whole as opposed to leaving the center completely blank. Also, I am not painting out to the edges since that will be covered by the border that will be glued over top of this. I once again switched back to the brush to start creating more detail and ensuring that my tree details aren't lost in the mist completely. I also referenced back to how this will look with the dragon. Periodically I placed the dragon onto the art to see which parts would show and ensure that no strange shapes were created once the dragon was added. Once I was happy with the painting, I mixed up some epoxy resin so I can go ahead and seal this paint in place. I used tabletop epoxy and I went ahead and degassed it in the vacuum chamber since I had that on hand. It's not supposed to be strictly necessary, but I figure getting out as many bubbles as possible can only improve the result. After it was in the vacuum chamber for a while, I checked the temperature to ensure it wasn't overheating. You can let it get up to, I believe, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. If it goes hotter than that, it won't ruin it, but it will set up quite a bit faster. I had intended to only do a thin brush-on coat for this first layer, but I realized that I had mixed up so much extra resin by mistake that I just went ahead and ended up adding it all on there and used this as my finish coat. Because that wasn't the plan from the start, I didn't have this set up on a level surface or anything. However, my board has a little bit of warp left in it anyways, so I wouldn't have been able to set that up perfectly. It worked out okay, so I allowed it to cure completely, and then I drilled in the holes where the dragon hardware will attach. In hindsight, it would have been better to do this later in the project, once I had the border installed so that it could be centered on the final placement of the border, versus right now, there are some edges that will still need to be sanded off to even everything up. epoxy didn't come out perfectly. There were some bubbles and some bits of dust, despite my best efforts to keep it protected while it was curing. So I sanded this down and then polished it with some polishing compound and an attachment on the drill. I switched over to the plastic polish for the final polishing using the finest sponge. I'm not sure if there's too much of a difference between these two, but I do prefer the plastic polish because it doesn't dry up so fast as the other polishing compound. These drill attachments will unscrew occasionally and just fall off. Because this was a relatively large piece for how small the drill attachment was, I was concerned that I would end up just burning out the drill by the time I got this perfectly smooth, and I found that there were some scratches that were too deep for this to get out that I had missed in the earlier sanding stage. Another thing here that I would do differently, I didn't clean the table surface thoroughly or have a large enough piece of cardboard masking that off, so there's a possibility I could have gotten grit in the sanding tool at this stage, so it would have been better to ensure I was working in a much cleaner environment to avoid contaminating with larger size grit that could cause additional scratches in the final polishing stage. I switched over to some hand polishing with a terry cloth covered sponge. This works pretty well for getting a final even polish over the top. In the end though, I just wasn't quite happy with how this was turning out still. So I ended up adding a coat of sealer over top. Before adding this sealer, I wiped the piece down with a tack cloth to ensure that there was no residual dust or fibers in the air that could have settled on it. And I also heated up the gloss enamel in a tub of hot water before applying it, doing my best to get the smoothest application possible with a rattle can. I did quite a few layers on this. I wanted to build up a thick enough finish. I kept rotating it to apply it in different directions to ensure that it was as even as possible. And then once that was dry, I removed the masking tape from the rest of the frame. In the end, though, it still just was not looking smooth enough. There was some orange peel forming on the surface. So I decided to polish this one more time. I wet sanded by hand with 1000 grit up to about 3000 grit. I may have gone higher than that. But I was just trying to get this as smooth as possible, and I wasn't using a sanding block because the surface itself isn't perfectly flat. And I didn't, at this stage, want to mistakenly sand through the sealer that I'd applied, so I just used the pressure of my hand to ensure it was as even as possible based on the existing finish. This took a good bit of time, just to carefully sand away as little as possible while still removing the orange peel. So I repeatedly wiped the surface with a dry towel to check how I was doing and see if the sheen was completely gone. At this stage it was nice and smooth to the touch, but still wasn't back to that gloss surface, so it needed to be polished again. I used just the plastic polish this time because I do like that product better. I was trying to do as much of the work by hand as I could so I wouldn't burn out the drill with that tiny little polishing tool. I pulled out the drill for just the final polish after I already had it to a pretty good shine and went over the whole surface with that, trying to get it to a perfect gloss finish. I think that it could still get to a glossier state with a proper polishing tool that I'm not worried about burning out by using it for extended periods over a large surface, but this was to a point that it was acceptable for the fact that a lot of this is going to be covered by the dragon anyways. So I just needed to be smooth enough that there were no distractions. So this is now finished. It's ready to have the rest of the frame installed and hanging hardware and then the final dragon attached.